number 15 in my 50 most relevant players for 2025. The guys I think you and I have to have a conversation about this pre-season before we get to any of the community series games. On today's episode, Errol Gulden. He's been a star for the last couple of years, but we've called on him as a community, and is there good, valid reason for that? Or is he just the fantasy premium we've forgotten this pre-season? Joining me on this episode of the 50 Most Relevant to talk about Errol Gulden. He's one of the many names and faces when you've played AFL Fantasy and tuned in to the HatChat podcast. Chances are you've heard his dulcet tones giving you some advice, some strategy, and some direction into or out of certain players. Mate, an absolute pleasure to have you on the episode. Errol Gulden's one of these guys that he just finds a way to score no matter what, doesn't he?
Yeah, thanks, MJ. Good to be on. Nice to be on quite high up the list again. I think we did Sam Walsh last year, so nice to talk about another gun mid. But yeah, Errol's a great player. I'm sure pretty much all of us have owned him over the last couple of seasons. He had that huge breakout 2 years ago, and last year more or less backs it up, dropped back a few points, but he's still right up the top end, at least in AFL Fantasy, which is what I'll cover on this podcast, and you can cover all the SuperCoach stuff.
I got you for that. Look, basically last year's seasonal average across the formats, almost identical, a 108.5 in AFL Fantasy, meaning you are forking out over $1.1 million in fantasy and literally just $900 off doing it pretty much in Dream Team, while in SuperCoach, a 108 seasonal average. So not even a full point per game off from what the two formats delivered. But he is going to sit you back a $581,900 price point in SuperCoach. DC, he's been so critical to this renaissance and the revival of the Swans over the last couple of years. He started out as this smart and crafty small forward, then pushed up to the ground to be a high half forward, and now over the last two seasons has become one of the most damaging in and outside midfielders. First in the league last year for inside 50, so he's the perfect player to get the ball into the Swans attacking half. And then he's actually number 2 in the league for meters gained. He's number 4 for kicks, 7th for uncontested possessions, and that's not cheap ball, that is work rate, getting him that level of uncontested possessions. And he's top 10 in the league per games for score involvements and goal assists. This is a pretty perfect midfielder. High time on ground, quality ball user, gets into uncontested spaces, and is happy to do the dirty and the hard stuff too. This is just about the perfect modern day midfielder for us.
Yeah, he's not far off. And it's crazy to think that I think he was a second rounder, around about pick 30 from memory in his draft. Like, you go back and look at how he slipped that far in the draft. It's ridiculous. He was obviously an academy pick, but why didn't no one bid on him earlier? Because pretty much since he's come into the comp, he's shown that he was one of the best in that draft class. And you could make the argument now that he's one of the best midfielders sort of under the age of 22, 23 in the comp. And you're right, like he's got some traits that not many players in the AFL have, particularly as midfielders. He's an elite kick, obviously he's a penetrating kick. He runs all day, and from a fantasy perspective and a SuperCoach perspective, that's a huge asset to have. The more time we have our players on the ground, the more chance they have to score points. But he's up over 90% time on ground, which for a midfielder is outrageous. So 90.6 to be exact, which is the second highest time on ground for any full-time mid last year, behind only Ed Langdon, who's not really your attacking midfielder. He's more of a defensive winger. So he really does stand out on his own there. It means that when the game is on his terms, and particularly when it gets on his wing, he can just rack up enormous quarters, enormous games. We saw that in AFL Fantasy last year. He went over 153 times. He topped that a couple of times the year before as well. He had 6 scores over 120. A lot of that is going to come from just the amount of time he's spending on the ground. If you look at it percentage-wise, if there's a comparable midfielder that's spending 80% time on ground, it's quite a big advantage. So that, I think, is a large reason why his scoring's been so outstanding the last couple of years. And I can't see any reason why that would change this year in terms of his time on ground and his potential access to points.
No, he's probably one of, if not the greatest athletic and aerobic players in the AFL right now. Like, his endurance rate to go alongside a high-end burst of speed over first 3 to 4 steps. So he's got this great power combination of speed, endurance, high skill, high footy IQ. It's how he gets those ceiling games that you talked about. Like, these are his frequency of 150s in AFL fantasy of the last, well, really since he debuted. Like, he's pumping out massive scores in those first couple of games, but really in the last 2 seasons, as you mentioned, since he's broken out, his ability to convert hundreds into game-changing 150-plus scores in AFL fantasy, it's rare we get that territory of scoring in AFL fantasy because it's just the raw ball data. And he does it too just fine in SuperCoach too. Like, we talk about these 6 120-plus scores in fantasy last year off the 14 tons. He still gives us 12 tons last year, and in SuperCoach, 4 scores over 140 and another 2 over 150. And so these are now the territories of scores. And if you put a VC or C on top of this sort of player, well, now you are putting damaging space in a rankings game and or protecting an injury affected or a poor rookie roulette performance. So he's the exact sort of player you want. And to go with it, rarely drops under 80. Like, outside of a poor opening round score last year, there's basically 1 or 2 other underwhelming scores all year. So high ceiling, high time on ground, high quality user, inside and outside, getting it done in all these capacities. Ranked 6th last year in fantasy for total points, 19th in SuperCoach, and that's off the back of the year prior. Going 5th in AFL fantasy for total points, 8th in SuperCoach for total points. There's so much about him that's so good. But DC, there's been a pretty significant change at the Swans in the off-season. Maybe not so much in the landing of players, although there is definitely a potential player that could be coming into this midfield that might change things up. But they've got a new coach. Dean Cox is in, John Longmire is out. How do you see Errol getting deployed? I agree with you. I don't think his time on ground is falling away too much, but are we going to see him as a bit more as an inside mid? He only had 36% bounce attendance last year. Is he going to stay on that wing? Does he drift back forward? What's your reading of the tea leaves of this Swans midfield mix and how it ultimately could affect Errol?
Yeah, I don't see too much changing. Obviously, the Swans made the grand final and they got belted, but I think most people would say they had just a bad day. They were outstanding for a lot of the year, and at the midway point of the season, they were almost unbackable as the flag favourites. So I wouldn't have thought Dean Cox will come in and make wholesale changes. And I think Errol is such a good player that they're going to want him in prominent roles, whether that's dominating on one wing or pushing a bit more inside. I think that 36% CBAs is interesting. It's actually the exact same amount he averaged across the previous season as well. But he was clearly the 4th in line, particularly after the first few rounds. So he actually only had, not that many games over 40%. And a lot of those, when they came late in the season, they were because one of the 3 key guys were out. So Rowbottom, Warner, and Heaney last year. So when you add in Callum Mills to that as well, potentially someone else to start taking some of that mid time too, maybe he is more permanent mid with just smatterings of inside time. But as we said, he's such a good runner. He's such a brilliant athlete that can stay on the ground for huge periods of time. And because he is so damaging by foot, unlike someone like an Ed Langdon, for example, or maybe a Harry Sharp, Jeremy Sharp, who are also outstanding runners, play high time on ground as wingers, but they're not as damaging as Errol. So they're still going to want the ball in his hands. The Swans move the ball a lot by foot, particularly at home, being the small ground. So I think they will use him when he gets into open space, and because he is such a good runner, he gets into open space a lot.
He's the 3rd best player based on 2024 stats from midfielders of scoring from transition. It's a Sam Flanders and a Jack Sinclair, who are the only players better, and arguably you could say that statistically is a little bit diluted, with both of those guys spending big chunks of the season last year coming off this halfback. And so just in a pure AFL fantasy sense, he's getting 65 points per game scoring from transition. So this is what makes him such a great accompaniment to this in and under strong and powerful midfield. And you've mentioned those names, including now the re-inclusion back of Mills, is he becomes a second touch player. while he's perfectly capable of winning the contested footy and extracting the ball at clearance, do you really want Errol there, or do you want him receiving the ball with a half metre of space and now doing what he was so well last year, being one of the best inside 50 ball users, one of the best high score involvement rate, goal assist players? Like, this is what made outside of Papley, an okay Sydney forward line, and I mean that with all respect. It's okay. Papley's elite, but the rest are okay. It's because they've just got such high, exquisite and high volume of ball use coming in, and Gulden's a core part of that. He's just so consistent at bringing that footy in. So I agree with you. I don't see this world where there's this grand shaping that all of a sudden he's only on a wing, where he's only on a half forward. I feel like they've got that mix about right. So it's 1 in every 3 centre bounces he's there. And other than that, it's using that high-end athleticism, endurance, that freak running patterns to get there. I think that sits about right. There is a narrative in the community. I don't think it's a wrong narrative, but we've probably double-dipped on everything has to have upside in our starting squad. I don't disagree with the sentiment, but sometimes we rule ourselves out of looking at a player because we look at them and go, that's it, there's no quote-unquote upside, so I'm not interested. And I think Gulden's probably a victim of that in the community. They look at his score and go, yeah, he was fine last year, but for 19 of the games last year, DC, he's one of, if not the best, midfielder in AFL Fantasy between rounds 1 to 21. So it's not a crappy small sample size. He goes at 114.2 in fantasy. And while probably not at the peak end in SuperCoach, or 111.8. Like, these are unbelievably good numbers still across the formats. So for people that are going, there's no upside around Errol, there's not just 2/3. There's like 90% of the year he is outperforming what his price point is.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think sometimes we forget that just because a player's priced at 108 or whatever he is, doesn't mean that there's no upside there. We saw him do it the year before. If I think back to one of my major stuff-ups in recent seasons, it was with Jack Steele, the year that he averaged about 120 in AFL Fantasy. And I actually had him the previous season when he broke out and he lost the tagger role, and I think he averaged about 107 or something in the COVID year. And I thought, well, there's no upside there. And he came out the next year and put another 13 points on it. And Errol kind of strikes me as the sort of guy that could have one of those just ridiculous outlier seasons. We seem to get almost 1 or 2 players every year that really push the 120 mark. Obviously, last year it was Rowan Marshall. The past couple of years, Tim English on the year before. We've had Took and Jack Steele in recent history as well. It wouldn't surprise me if Errol has one of those years. He's still only 22. In theory, he's coming into his prime. Maybe the next step for him is to just play full time on ground. I'm pretty sure he did talk about it last year, that he was open to doing it. So maybe that's where he gets his scoring bump, is that all of a sudden he's just not coming off the ground. If you can be a player as damaging as him and never rest, maybe that's where he gets his 5 to 10 points upside. I could see it happening.
Yeah, no, I could too. We talked a bit about market share throughout this series as well. Just using pure AFL fantasy market share data for a second, but there's some parallels for the super coaches tuning in. Sydney are a very well-rounded team, especially at the top end with their points sharing. Like, Errol's the clubhouse leader at 6.9% of scoring market share, but they've only got 4 guys over 6, and that's Grundy, Heaney, Warner, and Errol. And so it's not in crazy scoring capacities. They are 3rd overall for SuperCoach scoring last year, 7th in AFL Fantasy. So there is ways and pathways, DC, that you're talking through where his scoring bump could come in just 1, 2, 3 different areas. Where does this tag go? And that's very presumptuous that teams tag. Again, in 2025, we see it in and out. But gosh, you could build a pretty compelling case that depending on who they're playing, you should tag Papley and really lock down on him. You should tag Warner. You should tag Heaney. You should tag Gulden. gosh, even Mills at his peak a few years ago, you could build that case for. Like, how are we going to be able to identify? Well. Oh my gosh, forgot him. How do we identify if a tag is going to come his way? Because while we did talk about a lack of basement games in terms of the volume of them, when they do hit pretty hard with Errol. Like, I'm talking 60s sort of territory. Is there any kind of insight you've got for us or reflections you've got about where teams may or may not choose to get Gulden, or is it just simply team dependent?
Yeah, I mean, you are right. I think the tag risk is real for him, but as you said, they're a very even team. I think you can make the argument that Ahini was their most damaging player last year, had an absolutely outstanding season, who was probably leading the Brownlow in a lot of people's minds partway through the year. Mills will be interesting to see how it fits back in. I don't think he's quite as damaging necessarily as players like Heaney and Gulden, but Warner is probably in that category as well. Actually, wouldn't surprise me if Warner spends a little bit more time forward this year. He's a sneaky watch for a forward status change at some point, I reckon. But yeah, as I said, Nick Blakey's a very damaging player as well. So they've got a lot of guys that you could look to lock down on. I mean, this is why they've played in the grand final. So you can't tag them all. So there's going to be enough games, I think, where Gulden will get off the leash and teams just won't be able to go with him, or they won't have an obvious matchup. Not every team has an outstanding runner like him that can sit with him on a wing. So I think there's going to be enough ceiling games in there to probably offset maybe the odd tagged game, and I don't think he's necessarily the clear number one tag target. If we look at, I guess, why he dropped slightly last year as well, is the main drop-off in terms of stats was in his tackles. So he dropped from 5 tackles to 3.5 tackles a game. So I guess we have to think about what is more likely to repeat there. His disposals really didn't change all that much. So he's still getting a heap of the ball. Maybe it's just that he's spending slightly less time around stoppage, because 5 tackles for a wing is a lot, I would say. 3.5 is still pretty solid. So I'm guessing maybe that will stay around that mark, but it wouldn't surprise me if his disposals went up. He's just the sort of player that could have a ridiculous season where he's the disposal leader in the comp or something like that.
If the Swans even slow their ball movement down even half a gear and they play a heavier possession rate game, like, wow, the explosion could be of monstrosity moments for us. But while we've waxed lyrical about the potential pathways for scoring output that increases, and obviously the potential decrease around the tag and a very even share of points from the Swans, I think the greatest objection or hindrance for coaches to starting him is the Swans yet again appear in opening round. I don't think we're too concerned to watch his role. Of course, we're going to check it out, but I don't think that'll deter people in that. It's just the fact that they're missing in round 3. So they've got Hawks in opening round. So using 2024 data, not a great matchup. Then they've got the grand final rematch in round 1, the Dockers in round 2, the bye. Then a couple of nice matchups straight out of that, North and the Pies. And then again, a potentially more restrictive game against Port. I think that's the greatest obstacle for us to navigate, isn't it, DC? And especially in that bye round, we are looking stacked for value in all other lines. It does feel hard to prioritise him as a premium when we've got others that are comparable at a similar price range, let alone marginally cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I guess full disclosure, I'm probably not going to start him in AFL Fantasy. And this is the reason why, is that there's a world where he has significant upside, but there's also a world where he averages what he's priced at. And when you're losing one score out of your first 3 games and you're starting with a bit of a tough couple of matchups before that bye, that probably is enough to turn me off. And then, as you've already said, the other teams they've got the bye with are very fantasy relevant this year. So guys that have got the same bye, I mean, obviously his teammate Callum Mills is going to be very highly owned. The Brisbane guys that we're looking at in the back line as well, Kitty Coleman, if he does get up for round 1, is going to be popular. Both of the Ashcroft brothers are relevant. Nick Dacos, even if you want to go someone who's slightly cheaper than him on the same buy, maybe Nick Dacos is the one who's potentially got a similar sort of ceiling. And then Bailey Smith is one of the most common forward line picks. So there's probably 3 or 4 guys there easily that I would rather start over Gulden on the same bye. So then the question becomes, well, how many can you actually pick before it becomes a serious issue for you? And I guess the proof will be in the pudding there as to how well you can cover them on those buys. But my general philosophy last year for dealing with the early buys was don't pick a premium who is at risk of being fully priced. And there is a chance that that is the case for Errol, or at least he's within a couple of points of what he ends up averaging and maybe losing potentially 30, 50 points on that round because you've had to cover him with a rookie. Yeah. Maybe that means it's not worth it.
Yeah, it's true. Like last year we did have a Tom Green as the fast starter that was potentially and ultimately was viewed as underpriced, had an unbelievable 1-2 punch from a fixture perspective, and he delivered. I think where the Green dilemma, for those that jumped off the bye that got additionally rewarded, was he went down injured. I think it was almost a game straight after. And all of a sudden, any of that good work and goodwill that he'd built was undone for those that held through. And a luck factor landed on those that traded out. So if you're going hardcore into Errol Gulden, you're needing a couple of things to pop. And the most notable is you need Tom Green 2.0, like 140, 150, back to back. And then if your other trade variables that you're choosing to do that week all land in your favour. All possible, all doable, but this is the risk of and the luck variance you're loading into your side. Look, I'm with you. I can see a world where in AFL Fantasy, once my team is where a place that I'm settled and happy with it at the back end of the year, if Errol's not in it, it's only because he's got injured, is as far as I'm concerned. I just don't want to not have Errol in my AFL Fantasy team this year and SuperCoach. If the price gets right, I am all aboard him because this is one of the most damaging players in the game, that is for sure. On draft day, DC, both in a single season and in our Dynasty and Keeper League platform, all is up for grabs. Here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform, and you can draft on the Keeper platform in just a matter of days. All the details for that are in the description of this episode, by the way. It is the place to draft in 2025 for single season, Keeper and Dynasty Leagues. Unrivaled customization and just unbelievable some of the behind-the-scenes stuff you'll get to enjoy on draft day. Anyway, where are you picking Errol on draft day, DC? Because if you don't go early, you ain't getting your hands on him.
Yeah, exactly. I think he's the sort of pick, I reckon this is where I'd like to have maybe pick 4, 5, 6. I think is probably sort of the range I'll be looking at him. I think in AFL Fantasy, I think Tristan Sherry definitely goes before him. I think Sheasel definitely goes before him or should go before him. I would have said Marshall as well, but if he's touch and go for round 1, then who knows? And then it's really a pick your poison with the midfielders, I think. You can make the argument that someone like a Zach Merritt has done it so many years in a row. There's no reason why he can't be right up the top end. He doesn't miss games as well. It's probably the other point, we haven't touched on with Errol is that he hasn't missed a game since his debut year in 2021. So he's very durable. So for a draft pick, that's a super good thing to have. You don't want to be picking a first rounder who then misses half the season with little soft tissues. And that's why I'd be scared of picking someone like an Adam Treloar, even though he did get through all of last year. That's why I'd be scared of picking an Adam Treloar or someone like that with your early pick, even though he was the highest averaging midfielder in fantasy. So I think he's probably in the definitely the top 5 midfielders in AFL Fantasy single season drafts. You could argue he's the top midfielder in fantasy drafts. And then I guess in keepers, it's probably some of those similar names. So I'd probably throw Dacos up there as a potential to maybe be taken ahead of him. I think he's a year younger, but Gulden's done it back to back. Dacos did have a slight dip last year when moving into the midfield and is the clear tag target at the moment at the Pies. Sheasel, I think you could make the argument, particularly this year, given he's a defender, that he should go before him in keepers, also a year or 2 years younger, I think. And then maybe you want to go with one of the big rucks as your clear captaincy option if you're playing captains on in a keeper league. I'm sure it might be slightly different in SuperCoach though, so I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, SuperCoach, look, he's probably going to go in the second round. And that's either because you're going to have him as M1 because you're positionally locking away a ruck or a defender in one of those other lines, or he goes M2 if you're just rapid firing mid. I just see him yet again being a sort of top 15 sort of scoring territory player. You throw that consistency, the durability, the ceiling, you put it all together. For me in SuperCoach, if he's somewhere in the third round, just jump on because he's snuck through the gate. But to me, he's a pretty constant second round selection in SuperCoach, and I agree with you. First couple of selections off the draft board in AFL fantasy scoring, that's for sure. Hey, mate, love chatting with you. The HatChat boys are back for 2025. You dropped your first episode nearly almost a week ago now. Our weekly episodes are coming. What can we expect from the lads from HatChat?
Yeah, we're back to weekly, so well, at the moment, just weekly shows and sort of obviously trying to catch up. We're probably a month behind a lot of the other podcasts, including yourselves, who have been churning out the content like machines. So we're a little bit lazier, and we'll have a bit more of a break in our off season. But now that we're back, we'll be going all the way through until September, or at least the end of the home and away season. So yeah, the weekly recorded episodes will come out usually Monday or Tuesday, and then once the season gets a bit closer, maybe a week or two out, we might kick back up with the live Spaces shows that we've been doing for a few years on X or Twitter as it used to be known. And they're on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. So everyone's welcome to come along and listen live and ask questions, and we'll try and help you out with your teams.
Yeah, one of the most interactive AFL fantasy content creators going around. Almost every time I've had a chance to jump on and watch and listen into one of these live streams, a question gets asked, they never disrespect it. They always take the time to answer it. Even if they're going to have some fun and play with it, they'll always give you an answer around it as well. And so definitely, if you want to have some questions answered during the pre-season and season proper HatChat, streaming regularly on X. And now, of course, we've put the details of the description of where you can get in touch with DC and the rest of the boys from HatChat in the description of this episode. And then also some of the places you can download, stream, and listen into some of the content the boys are dropping. Hey, mate, an absolute pleasure. I'm sure it won't be the last time we chat during either the preseason or season proper of 2025. We wish you all the best, my friend.
Thanks, mate. Enjoyed it. It was great.
Absolutely. If you want to check out any of the other episodes of the 50 most relevant, maybe you're just catching up. You're like, oh, yeah, we're like a week or two away from some community series and intra-club matches. Like, we better get to work. That's okay. We've got a heap of pre-season research done for you there. Pick and choose the players that you're interested in. There's some great collaborators have joined alongside us here at the Coaches Panel to give you far and above our biggest and best ever series of the 50 most relevant. Whether you want to listen to the audio platforms, and if you are, make sure you subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. It's one of the very small and simple things you can do that have a huge impact for us. Or you can watch these episodes as a video. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Turn the notifications on. There is videos dropping every single day of the preseason. Inside the description of this episode, friends, are the details of not only to get in touch with DC and the boys from HatChat, but also where you can keep in touch with us, get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch, and become members of our Patreon. Our Patreons are getting a ton of exclusive access and rewards to a bunch of stuff, including our draft rankings that are getting drip-fed in full for our Patreons. Publicly, we'll make a few things available, but they're getting everything available to us. And in fact, just a couple of people who become premium supporters in the last day or two. Chris, thank you for your support. And Mitch Casey, good to see you in there, my brother. We have shared Patreon subscription. We have cancelled each other out. Look at us go. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you on there, Mitch. Hey, if you want to join them and others, all the details for a Patreon in the description of this episode. All right. You ready for a clue about who's at number 14? My goodness, we are 2 weeks away from wrapping up this series. Here's a clue for you. He was a year of halves. There was one half that this player was the must-have guy. If you didn't have him, he was not just putting captaincy scores up for you. He was putting scores that was separating himself from not just anyone in his line, but everyone across the competition. And then there was another half of the season where it was a disastrous, painful hold because there was always a reason to never trade him out. But for whatever variable reason, he was overpriced and painful for us. But is he more like the former or the latter heading into 2025? Because I can see a world where this guy, based on a few variables, has the hot hand to start 2025. And that if you don't start with him, it's going to be impossible to justify paying up for him, because when he gets that hot hand, nobody is better than him across the formats. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.